think back to September 2001. It was a moment that really defined a whole generation. A wounded nation came together, but almost no one could have imagined what the true cost of the path ahead would be. And we're not just talking about years, we're talking about trillions of dollars.
So just 9 days after the attacks, President George W. Bush stood before a joint session of Congress. And his words, man, they just captured the feeling of a nation and really a world that had been changed forever. Okay, so first up, let's talk about the catalyst. What really kicked all of this off? Well, in the wake of the attacks, the country's grief, it just morphed into this incredibly powerful, unified resolve. Something had to be done. And this right here, this was the mood of the country. It was put in the clearest possible terms. You see, it wasn't a question of if we were going to respond, it was how. That resolve, that feeling, it became the engine for everything that came next. So, that leads us to the mission being declared. Let's look at how that national feeling, that anger and resolution, was channeled into a global mission with a very specific target in mind. The enemy was identified pretty quickly, Al-Qaeda. And what's really interesting here is the analogy they used. They compared Al-Qaeda to the mafia. It was a way to make this kind of shadowy group understandable to everyone. But, and this is the key part, their goal wasn't making money. It was about remaking the world and forcing their radical beliefs on everyone. Okay, so the enemy is defined. Next, a super clear ultimatum was given to the Taliban in Afghanistan because they were sheltering Al-Qaeda. And these demands, as you can see, were explicit. They were, and I'm quoting here, not open to negotiation or discussion, period. And this right here is where everything just exploded in scope. It wasn't just about one group anymore. This single statement declared a global, totally open-ended conflict. The war on terror was born, and it had no clear borders and really, no clear end in sight. If you think back to 2001, this was the question on everyone's mind. The whole country was focused on the how. How do we fight this? How do we win? It was all about strategy, all about tactics. But fast forward 20 years, and the question has totally changed. It's not how anymore. Now it's how much. And believe me, the answer is just staggering. And that brings us right to the heart of this, the price tag. We're about to get into the financial reality of this entire post-9/11 era. And it's a number so huge, it's honestly hard to even wrap your head around.
Now, before we get to the big number, you should know where this data is coming from. It's from something called the Costs of War Project. This is a huge research effort from Boston University and Brown University. So what we're looking at is based on some serious academic work, giving us a really solid foundation for these figures.
Okay, you ready? $8 trillion. That's the total estimated cost. And that number isn't just money that's already been spent by different government departments. It also includes costs we're already on the hook for in the future, especially when it comes to taking care of our veterans. So this whole financial breakdown is part of a larger look at the full impact of 20 years of war. But it begs the question, right? Where did all that money actually go? So how do you even get to a number like $8 trillion? Well, it's not as simple as just bombs and bullets. The real story, the fascinating part, is when you break it down, you start to see all these different costs. And some of them, they're not what you'd expect at all. Okay, take a look at this. Yeah, the direct war spending from the Department of Defense is massive, over $2 trillion. But check out the other parts. You've got $1 trillion for Homeland Security, another $1 trillion, get this, just in interest on the money we borrowed to pay for the wars. And the biggest slice of the pie? Future care for veterans. We're talking an estimated $2.2 trillion. All right, let's break this down a little more. Looking at the numbers up through fiscal year 2022, you see the direct war money, sure, but look closer. There's over $1 trillion in interest payments alone, plus another $1 trillion for Homeland Security. It's like these are the hidden accounting books of the whole conflict. Let's just pause on this one for a second, because it's maybe the most important long-term takeaway from the whole report. The single biggest cost of these wars isn't something we've paid already. It's what we're going to pay out over the next 30 years for medical and disability care for veterans. That is a multi-generational financial commitment we've made. And this is so important to remember, and the report itself points this out. These aren't just abstract numbers on a spreadsheet, Behind every single one of those dollars is a person, a soldier who was deployed, a security agent at an airport, a doctor who's caring for a wounded veteran. Now this is just wild. Look at the contrast. Back in late 2002, some White House officials thought the high-end cost for the war in Iraq might be, $50 to $200 billion. The reality, when you factor in the entire war on terror and all its future costs, ended up being $8 trillion. They weren't just a little off. Their high-end guess was off by a factor of 40. Just incredible. All right, let's bring this all home. We started by looking at the principles, the emotions that launched this whole era. We've seen the absolutely astronomical price tag. So now comes the reckoning.
Remember this line from the beginning? Freedom and fear are at war? That was the central theme President Bush laid out back in 2001. This idea of a battle between two huge forces. Well, 20 years and $8 trillion later, looking at it through that lens really makes you stop and think. What was the cost of that war? There was this really powerful moment near the end of that 2001 speech. The president held up the police shield that belonged to George Howard, a Port Authority officer who died at the World Trade Center, and he called it a reminder of a task that does not end. That phrase, it just perfectly captures the indefinite, open-ended nature of the mission they were starting. And so that leaves us with this final, really essential question. When you define a mission as something that's unending, and you see its price tag grow into the trillions, what is the true price of a task that does not end?